It all started with intuition, that subtle nagging that grows deep in my chest and refuses to be ignored. The feeling had been eating away at me for days, like a shadow hanging over moments that should have been peaceful. Her phone was always on silent, and her increasingly detailed apologies seemed planned with surgical precision. But the final blow came when I overheard an unassuming comment in the company corridor: "He always seems to be in good hands at the office." At first, I wanted to dismiss it. Perhaps it was paranoia, the fruit of my mind trying to justify a marriage that seemed to be falling apart, even if for no clear reason. But curiosity, or perhaps the fear of discovering something I wasn't ready to face, spoke louder. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I waited until silence took over the house, and while she said she would be in a meeting, I followed a silent plan. I arrived at the office late, when the lights in most of the rooms were already off. The corridor was empty, with only my hesitant footsteps echoing. The boss's door was ajar, revealing a slit of yellowish light. My heart raced. I took a deep breath, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was just work. But there was nothing professional about what I saw as I gently pushed the door open. There they both were, wrapped in a closeness that left no doubt as to what was going on. She laughed softly, a laugh I hadn't heard for years. My world stopped at that moment. Every bit of happiness shared between us was crushed by that scene. But what devastated me even more was the naturalness of the moment, as if I didn't exist. As if our marriage was just a facade for something more convenient. "I wasn't expecting visitors at this hour," he said, his voice filled with arrogant confidence, without even raising his eyes to me. She looked at me, pale as a sheet of paper, but before she could say anything, something in me exploded. The anger, the humiliation, the desire to expose what they had done to me. "I hope you enjoy the audience," I said, loud enough for the echoes to reverberate through the corridors of the company. "Everyone will know who you really are." The next few minutes were a blur. Shouting, pathetic attempts at explanation, and my final decision: divorce is the only thing I'm going to take away from this. I left before my impulse made me cross the line into violence. But the damage had already been done, not just to the room, but to me. However, that night was only the beginning. What I thought was the end point was actually the opening of a story of even deeper betrayals, secrets that threatened not only my dignity, but the entire structure of the company and the people around me. Finding out how far they had gone to hide their lies became my goal. And it was on this path that I realized that their betrayal was not only an affront to our marriage, but also a dangerous web that could destroy everything I had built. But there was one question that wouldn't leave me alone: how far should I go to get revenge? Welcome to the canal. Here, we don't tolerate any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal can devastate lives, destroying trust and relationships. Get ready for an intense narrative full of twists and turns. Now, take a deep breath, because the story you're about to hear will shock you. Good story. Alexander had always prided himself on his work ethic. By the age of 38, he had reached a top position in one of the largest technology companies in the region. Disciplined, detail-oriented and passionate about what he did, his routine consisted of long hours at the office and evenings devoted to his family. He and Sophia, his wife, were known by friends as the perfect couple, two people who seemed to have found the formula for happiness in marriage. Both always seemed in sync, sharing inside jokes and stories of their intertwined lives. However, like many things that appear perfect, their relationship was more complex than it seemed. Sophia, at 35, had a striking presence. An artist of recognized talent, she divided her time between working in the studio and running the household. While Alexander immersed himself in reports and meetings, Sophia brought to life vibrant canvases and sculptures that exuded intense emotions. Despite this, she often felt that her creativity was stifled by the monotony of domestic life. Motherhood was never part of her plans, something that caused silent friction in the marriage. Alexander, while respecting her decision, didn't hide his desire to build a larger family. This point of disagreement was something they rarely discussed directly, but whose shadow hung over every interaction. They lived in a spacious house in a quiet neighborhood. Days began with Alexander leaving early, the sound of the door closing being the soundtrack to Sophia preparing breakfast. She would spend hours in the studio, often losing track of time until the sunlight began to fade. The evenings, however, were a constant battle to maintain the closeness that once seemed natural. While Sophia wanted to share stories of artistic inspiration, Alexander was often exhausted, preferring silence or small distractions like TV shows. The relationship with Alexander's work colleagues was another point of discomfort. He was close to his boss, Ethan, a charismatic man and a born strategist. Ethan, with his ability to win allies with a simple smile, played the role of mentor and friend to Alexander. Sophia, however, never sympathized with him. "Watch out for Ethan," she would say occasionally, in the lightest possible tone, although her words carried a weight that Alexander never questioned. For Sophia, Ethan seemed to represent everything she rejected: superficiality and manipulation. For Alexander, he was a model of success. An example of what could be achieved with dedication and strategic vision. It was through this coexistence at work that Alexander channeled his ambition, often overlooking his wife's signs of discomfort at Ethan's increasingly constant presence in their lives. However, there was something else that troubled Sophia. She felt disconnected, as if the man she had married had changed over the years. Alexander was more distant, his attention seemed fragmented, divided between work and a marriage that he assumed was too solid to require effort. Sophia, on the other hand, was looking for signs of vitality in their relationship. Small gestures that could rekindle the flame of something she feared she had lost. The routine at home was interrupted by occasional meetings with friends. Sophia maintained a circle of acquaintances in the artistic world, while Alexander, more reserved, preferred to avoid these meetings. He found them tedious, often saying that he didn't understand Sophia's obsession with purposeless conversations. On the other hand, Ethan often invited the couple to work dinners. Sophia rarely went, feeling uncomfortable in an environment where everyone seemed to be measuring forces, rather than sharing moments. In recent months, Alexander had noticed a subtle change in Sophia's behavior. She seemed more reserved, the silences between them became longer. When he tried to discuss something important, she would divert the conversation to trivial topics, such as the decor in the living room or the plants in the garden. He, in turn, began to question internally whether she was really happy. Although he would never openly admit it, Alexander feared that the life he had worked so hard to build might not be enough to keep her satisfied. On the other side, Sophia was struggling with an internal battle that was consuming her. She wondered how a marriage that had begun with so much promise had reached this point of apathy. Despite her doubts, she continued to play the role of devoted wife, preparing meals, keeping the house in order, hoping that somehow time would heal the emptiness she felt. Alexander's work began to demand more of him. Nights at the office became frequent, and with them, so did the excuses. He said it was to secure a promotion that could change their lives. Sophia supported him in words, but deep down she felt left behind. The idea that Alexander was sacrificing everything for something they might not even need made her even more uneasy. Ethan, on the other hand, always seemed to be around, a constant presence in the stories Alexander brought home. Ethan managed to close that huge contract. Ethan has an incredible vision for solving problems. Sophia listened, but she didn't feel part of the narrative. For her, Ethan was just another figure representing the growing distance between her and her husband. The weeks passed, and the disagreements piled up. Small arguments became frequent, but they always ended without resolution. Alexander believed that this was normal. Every marriage has its ups and downs, he thought. Sophia, however, was increasingly convinced that something needed to change. She wanted to feel alive again, to find a way to recover the enthusiasm that seemed to have been left in the past. And it was in this context that the dynamic between them began to change. Small gestures became loaded with hidden meanings. A forgotten dinner, a distant look, an unanswered message on the cell phone, everything seemed to carry the weight of something bigger. For Alexander, it was just a phase. For Sophia, it was the harbinger of inevitable change. The two went about their routine as best they could, trying to sustain a relationship that seemed more fragile by the day. However, they were both unaware of what was lurking there, a truth that, when it came to light, would be capable of shaking not only their marriage, but also everything they had built up over the years. Time went on, but the emptiness between Alexander and Sophia seemed to grow every day. As he devoted himself more and more to work, his evenings at the office became a convenient excuse to avoid the discomfort he felt at home. Sophia, on the other hand, took refuge in her studio, creating works that carried an emotional intensity she couldn't put into words. The silence between them was no longer just a pause, it was an abyss. Alexander began to notice details he had previously ignored. The way Sophia looked away during meals, the touches that became rare and awkward, and the moments when she seemed distant, lost in thoughts he couldn't access. But he justified it to himself, work demanded his total dedication, and everyday tiredness explained the distance. After all, wasn't it normal for every marriage to face periods like this? That's what he preferred to believe. On the other side, Sophia tried to maintain normality, but there was something in her posture that gave away her discomfort. Her inspiration walks became more frequent, and Alexander noticed that she seemed more careful with her appearance at random moments. It wasn't something he usually questioned, but lately, it made him hesitate. He suppressed his thoughts. He didn't want to feed insecurities that might just be the fruit of his tired mind. Meanwhile, at the office, Alexander was facing new pressures. Ethan, always manipulative and direct, made it clear that Alexander's performance would be crucial to the success of an imminent merger. "There's no room for error now," he said with his typical confidence. The weight of responsibility was suffocating him, but Alexander saw this as a chance to prove his worth, not only to the company, but also to himself. He believed that this success could rekindle something at home, show Sophia that everything was worth it. However, things began to get out of hand. One evening, Alexander was surprised by a call from a colleague who worked in the finance department. "Did you know that there are discrepancies in some reports that are linked to Ethan?" the colleague asked in a concerned tone. Alexander denied any involvement, but the doubt planted in his mind began to grow. He became suspicious of the relationship between Ethan and the company's business. Although he had trusted his boss's ethics until then, something seemed out of place. Determined, he began to investigate discreetly, reviewing contracts and documents. What he found made him shudder, but he still had no concrete proof. At home, Sophia continued to distance herself. Her meetings to seek inspiration seemed more mysterious. One evening, when he came home early from work, Alexander noticed something unusual. Sophia's perfume, which was usually soft, was stronger, mixed with a slight note of wine. She claimed she had met up with a friend, but her explanation was brief and unenthusiastic. He didn't want to confront her, but the feeling that something was wrong now followed him like a shadow. That's when everything began to converge. Alexander's nightly meetings and Sophia's frequent outings were drawing a pattern that he could no longer ignore. He decided to act. Certain that he would discover something, he began to observe more closely, but without revealing his suspicions. Over the next few days, small details began to fall into place. Messages that Sophia quickly deleted, vague excuses about delays and a tension in the air that seemed about to explode. Then an opportunity arose. Alexander received an unexpected notification of a meeting that had been moved forward to the next morning instead of the evening. This meant that he could get home early, but instead of telling Sophia, he decided to keep his arrival a secret. Something inside him told him that it was time to confirm what he feared. When he entered the house, he found silence. The kitchen was spotless and the lights were off, except for a distant glow coming from Sophia's studio. He hesitated, but decided to go there. As he approached, he heard muffled laughter and voices that didn't just belong to his wife. His heart raced. He slowly opened the door and what he saw made his world fall apart. Sophia was there, laughing with Ethan in a way that Alexander hadn't seen for years. The closeness between them was undeniable, as if the whole world around them had disappeared. Shock paralyzed him for a few seconds, but anger soon took over. He entered abruptly, the sound of the door slamming echoing through the room. Sophia froze, and Ethan's smile instantly crumbled. "I was right, then," Alexander said, his voice laden with frustration and hurt. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia tried to speak, but couldn't find the words. Ethan, with his usual shaken self-confidence, remained silent, staring at Alexander with an expression that mixed guilt and defiance. "How many times? How long has this been going on?" Alexander demanded, his voice getting louder with every word. Sophia, visibly shaken, mumbled something about it not being what it seemed, but he no longer wanted to hear it. Her words were irrelevant in the face of the image that was unfolding before him. Ethan tried to intervene, saying it was a misunderstanding, but Alexander interrupted him with a firm gesture. "Get out of here," he said to Ethan, his voice carrying an authority that his boss couldn't ignore. Ethan hesitated, but eventually left, leaving Alexander and Sophia alone in the studio. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken words and accumulated hurt. "You destroyed everything," said Alexander, finally breaking the silence. Sophia tried to move closer, but he backed away. "Don't you dare say it didn't mean anything. Not after that." Without waiting for further explanations, Alexander left the house, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the night. He didn't know where to go, but he knew he couldn't stay there. The betrayal was obvious, but something inside him told him that there was more behind the scene, something he still didn't understand. Alexander felt the weight of the hours. He had spent the night wandering aimlessly, driving through empty streets, his thoughts scrambled by the whirlwind of emotions. Sophia's face and Ethan's presence in his home kept running through his mind. Every laugh, every look of complicity he witnessed made his breathing heavy, almost impossible. When he finally parked the car somewhere, he realized that dawn was already breaking. But something inside him insisted that there was still more to discover. The betrayal was only the beginning, there were loose pieces that needed to be fitted together. Determined, Alexander took out his cell phone and began to sift through work records and messages involving Ethan. He remembered the suspicions raised about the company's finances and how Ethan seemed to be directly connected. As she reviewed the documents in the stifling silence of the car, the information began to line up. There were signatures, transfers of funds and authorizations that didn't make sense. Ethan was embezzling money from the company, and worse, he was using Alexander's name to cover up his actions. With trembling hands, Alexander realized the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just a marriage that was falling apart, his hard-earned career was also under threat. It was clear that Ethan had been manipulating him for months. Personal and professional betrayal were connected, but he needed proof. And more than that, he needed answers from Sophia. What did she know? Why had she allowed everything to come to this? When he finally returned home at dawn, Alexander found Sophia sitting on the sofa, her eyes red and tired. She was holding a cup of tea, but it looked more like an automatic gesture than a real attempt to calm down. The sound of the door opening made her look up, and for a moment they were both silent, just staring at each other. Alexander felt a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "You knew," he finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but charged with an intensity that cut through the air. Sophia put her cup down on the coffee table and stood up slowly, hesitating before speaking. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Sophia. Not now. I've spent the night putting the puzzle together, and everything points to you and Ethan. The betrayal, the money, the company, how long has this been going on?" She seemed about to answer, but something stopped her. Her previously guilt-ridden expression was filled with a fear Alexander had never seen before. He took a step forward, insisting, "Speak. What do you know about embezzlement in the company? Alexander, please, it's not like you think. Then explain it to me. He shouted, unable to contain the explosion of feelings. Because, from my point of view, you were in my studio, with my boss, while he was not only ruining our marriage, but also trying to destroy my career. Sophia took a deep breath, as if she were preparing to jump off a cliff. Finally, she began to speak, her voice shaking. I didn't know about the money, not at first. Ethan came to me months ago. He said that you were at risk, that there were suspicions about you in the company, and that he was trying to protect you. I believed him. Protect you? And what exactly did he ask for in exchange for this protection? Alexander spat out the words, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. Sophia lowered her eyes, as if the shame was an unbearable weight. He said he needed something to make sure you were safe. That if I was by his side, he could keep everything under control. Alexander felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He took a step back, shocked. So you thought the best way to protect me was to get involved with him? Did you really think that was going to save me? I was desperate. Sophia shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. He manipulated me, Alexander. He said that if I didn't agree, you could end up fired, investigated, destroyed. And you believed him? Alexander shouted back, fury exploding again. Did you think that betraying our marriage was the only solution? Sophia began to cry, but Alexander had no more room for empathy. He was at a point of no return, and her every word only added fuel to his anger. Ethan is stealing the company, he finally said, his tone cold and calculated. And he used you to make sure I stayed in the dark while he did it. And now, thanks to you, I'm in the middle of it. My career, my reputation, everything is at stake. I didn't know about the money. Sophia insisted between sobs. I just wanted to protect you. And you ended up destroying everything, he replied, his voice laced with bitterness. You didn't protect me, Sophia. You exposed me. Alexander turned away, unable to look at her any longer. He needed to act, and fast. Ethan had not only betrayed his trust, but also put his entire life at risk. And Sophia, with her desperate attempt to solve the problem, had only made everything worse. Before leaving again, Alexander turned one last time to Sophia. I'll sort it out. But when it's over, so are you and I. Her silence was deafening as he walked out the door. Sophia knew she had crossed a line from which she could not return. The man she loved was broken, and it was largely her fault. As Alexander got into his car, determined to confront Ethan and expose the whole truth, Sophia was left alone, facing the consequences of her choices. Alexander drove in silence, the sound of the engine the only noise in the stifling atmosphere of the car. His mind was racing, going over every detail of what he had discovered. Sophia's betrayal was an open wound, but Ethan's scheme had turned what was once a personal hurt into an existential challenge. Everything Alexander had built, his career, his reputation and even his dignity, was hanging by a thread. He knew that acting without a plan would be disastrous, but time was not in his favor. Ethan was a smart man, and now that the siege was closing in, he could do anything to protect himself. He stopped the car in front of a discreet building, a place where he knew he could get vital information. The office of a former colleague, now a lawyer specializing in corporate fraud, was his only chance of understanding the size of the problem before confronting Ethan. Alexander walked in, ignoring the anxiety growing inside him. The lawyer, a straightforward, soft-spoken man, greeted him with a worried expression when he heard the details. "You're in a delicate position, Alex," said the lawyer, putting the papers back on the table. "If the signatures you mentioned really were forged, that puts you in two positions, victim or accomplice." Alexander frowned, the tension in his face becoming more evident. "There's no chance of me being an accomplice. I've never signed anything that wasn't legitimate." The lawyer sighed. "I believe you, but it doesn't matter what you know. It matters what can be proved. Ethan can use this to frame you and divert his attention. You need something solid, something that puts the blame squarely on him. Alexander nodded slowly. He knew he had to act with precision. It was a question of survival. After a long conversation about strategy, he left the office with a plan, to access Ethan's confidential files. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he had to try. Back at work, Alexander felt the weight of his colleagues' stares. He knew that rumors were starting to circulate. Ethan was probably already trying to control the narrative. To keep up appearances, Alexander went into his office, closed the door and began to gather evidence that might corroborate his suspicions. He knew that Ethan kept a personal laptop that he rarely used in the office. The idea of accessing that computer was risky, but it was his only chance. When night fell and most of the employees had left the building, Alexander put his plan into action. He knew that Ethan had a peculiar habit of working late, so he waited patiently in his office until he heard his boss's firm footsteps leaving the office. As soon as the opportunity arose, he entered Ethan's office, his heart racing but his movements calculated. He found his laptop and quickly plugged in a USB stick to clone the files. Time seemed to drag on, every second accompanied by the fear of being caught. When he finally finished, Alexander left the room, trying to look calm, but the sweat on his hands showed his nervousness. Back in his office, he started going through the files. What he found left him speechless. Transfers to accounts in tax havens, fraudulent contracts, and even messages exchanged between Ethan and others involved in the scheme. But there was more. Among the emails, he found messages from Sophia. They were vague, but made it clear that she knew more than she had admitted. The pain Alexander felt when he read those messages was unlike any other. It wasn't just the physical or emotional betrayal. It was the feeling that Sophia had deliberately omitted truths that could have protected him. He closed his laptop, his fists clenched. The moral dilemma was now unbearable. Exposing Ethan would mean exposing Sophia too. He wanted justice, but at what cost? The next day, Alexander confronted Sophia. She was at home, sitting on the same sofa where she had waited for him the night before. When he entered, she looked up, but her expression showed that she knew what was coming. "Why didn't you tell me everything?" Alexander asked, his voice low but charged with emotion. Sophia took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for an inevitable blow. "I wanted to protect you, but I was also afraid. I didn't know how far Ethan was willing to go. You knew enough to tell me something. Why did you choose silence?" He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Because I thought I could control the situation," she replied, her voice trembling. "I thought I could keep you out of it." Alexander laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "And in doing so, you threw me into the middle of it." She started to cry, but he didn't console her. The pain and anger were too mixed for him to separate the emotions. "I found out enough to bring Ethan down," he continued. "But if I do that, you'll be dragged down too. What do you suggest I do, Sophia? Because, right now, I don't see a way out that doesn't destroy everything." Sophia tried to pull herself together, but the desperation was evident. "I have no excuses, Alex. But if you want me to, I'll face the consequences. I know I've ruined everything." Alexander didn't reply immediately. He just got up, grabbed his car keys and left the house. He needed time to think. With every kilometer he drove, Sophia's words echoed in his mind. "I know I've ruined everything." But he knew it wasn't just her fault. Ethan's greed and manipulation had been the catalyst for it all. He stopped the car in front of a park and sat on a bench, watching children playing while their parents laughed and talked. He felt a pang of envy for that simplicity, for that kind of happiness that seemed so far from his reality now. But he also felt a resolve growing inside him. There was something he could do, something that would not only put right what was wrong, but also give him a new purpose. Determined, Alexander stood up. He knew that the next step would be the hardest. But for the first time in days, he felt he had control over his life again. Alexander entered the company meeting room with a presence he hadn't felt for a while. On his face, the calm of someone who has already mapped out all the steps, but in his chest, his heart was racing with adrenaline. The evidence he had gathered against Ethan was stored in a black folder that he held tightly, and every word of what he was going to say was clear in his mind. It was time to expose the whole truth, not only about Ethan's crimes, but also about the betrayal that had crumbled his personal life. The directors of the company were gathered, with Ethan sitting at the head of the table, exuding his usual self-confidence. When he saw Alexander enter, he gave a sarcastic smile, but the expression quickly disappeared when Alexander placed his briefcase on the table and began to speak. "I ask for a few minutes of everyone's attention to present information that directly affects this company and its integrity," Alexander began, his voice firm. He opened the folder and began distributing the documents. Each page revealed financial transfers, forged contracts and compromising communications involving Ethan. The room, previously filled with murmurs, fell into a tense silence. "This is absurd." Ethan stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. "You're making all this up to frame me." Alexander remained impassive. "Every document is authenticated. And if necessary, I'm willing to hand everything over to the authorities." He paused, looking directly at Ethan. "Your scheme has come to an end." The directors, shocked, began to argue amongst themselves. Within minutes, it was clear that Ethan had no way out. One of the executives picked up the phone and called the police, while another ordered Ethan removed from the building. The man who once manipulated everyone around him was now cornered, his lies exposed for all to see. As he was escorted out, he took one last look at Alexander, full of hatred and impotence. After the meeting, Alexander felt a mixture of relief and emptiness. He had protected his career in the company, but the personal price he had paid was too high. His trust in Sophia had been destroyed, and he knew there was no going back. Determined, he went home one last time. Sophia was sitting on the sofa, her eyes swollen from crying. When Alexander entered, she stood up slowly, as if anticipating the words he would say. "It's done," said Alexander, crossing his arms. "Ethan has been exposed and will be arrested. The company is safe." Sophia nodded, but said nothing. There was something in Alexander's expression that prevented her from attempting any defense or pleading. "What about us?" she finally asked, her voice low and hesitant. Alexander sighed deeply, as if searching for the strength to answer. "There is no more us, Sophia. What happened can't be undone. You made decisions that broke something that will never be repaired. I loved you, but that's no longer enough." His words fell on her like a blow, and Sophia began to cry again, but Alexander didn't waver. He knew it was the right decision, however painful. He picked up his bags, which were already packed, and walked out the door without looking back. It was the end of a chapter, but also the beginning of something new. In the months that followed, Alexander immersed himself in his career, but also began to rebuild his personal life. At a business conference, he met Lara, a lawyer with whom he had long and honest conversations. Unlike Sophia, she was direct and straightforward, and this attracted him. Over time, the two began to grow closer, and Alexander, for the first time in a long time, felt he could make room for love again. Sophia, on the other hand, faced the consequences of her choices. Her relationship with Ethan had destroyed not only her marriage, but also her reputation in artistic circles. Struggling with remorse, she devoted herself to a new series of works that reflected her pain and regret. The exhibition of these pieces was well received, but Sophia knew that artistic recognition did not fill the void left by the loss of Alexander. Ethan, after being arrested, faced a public and humiliating trial. The evidence against him was undeniable, and his sentence came quickly. He lost everything: his position, his freedom and the respect of anyone who had ever considered him a leader. His fall was as swift as his rise, and he now lived in oblivion, an example of how greed and manipulation can destroy even the most powerful. For Alexander, justice had been served, but he knew the scars would remain. However, next to Lara, he felt there was a new chance to build something real, something based on trust and mutual respect. He still looked to the past, but the future finally looked promising. If you've made it this far, let us know in the comments what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more impactful stories like this one. Here, we never support any form of betrayal, and we believe that trust is the foundation of any relationship. See you next time.